Hey everyone, I'm Angela Lynn.
And I'm Jesse Lynn, and welcome back to another episode, a mini episode of But Where Are You Really From? This week, we're going to do a brief discussion, primer, conversation on what self love is. I think if you look back at a few of our episodes, we've definitely discussed that through the lens of just mental health, getting help. Also, I feel like this podcast in and of itself is kind of an expression of self-love, right? We're really thinking about our identity, how to like reconcile different parts of who we are so that we come to like a better acceptance or congruence of self, like feel really comfortable about all these different identities that we come from. So I love topics like these because it's so open-ended. The term self-love means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I will say, starting off for myself, I think self-love is just like radical acceptance of everything about yourself, including some of the thoughts and behaviors that are deemed harmful. And I'm coming to see that like more and more, just like talking to friends and like working through struggles. And it's funny because you don't really see it until you like talk to someone else about it, but like a lot of my other friends are going through like relationship issues, and when they talk to me about it, I'm like, oh, this is the same thing that I'm going through. But then I have this like different perspective. I'm like, why are you like making yourself feel bad about feeling bad? Like, you already feel bad enough as it is. Like, you should just accept this emotion and like accept that it's a part of like what you're going through, and it's normal and positive to have a different range of emotions and move on. So yeah, it's funny because I didn't really like start to understand it for myself until I started to like see it in other people. But for sure, for myself, I think self-love is really just accepting all of the different parts of who you are, your reactions, your emotions, your decisions, and just being okay with that and not judging yourself for those things. What about you?
I love that. Yeah, this is a super interesting topic because I did a little bit of like article reading as we usually do, like some light internet searching on the topic just to see what kind of like different perspectives people have as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, the term self-love is like so open-ended because it can get conflated with things like self-care, self-help, self-confidence, self-esteem, like all these different self things. And I do agree, I think it means kind of like a little bit different of a thing to each person. Something just like interesting that I found, which I don't know if you knew, is like there's like a very long history of this concept of self love. I think for us as like young people, we think or I at least just like throw myself under the bus. I think I saw this term of like self love, self care, like treat yourself, essentially like that kind of mentality
Mm-hmm.
as relatively newer. Like I attributed it to kind of like paralleling the mental health movement where we, started focusing on like normalizing therapy and meditation and all these things. But actually, there is like a long standing history of this idea of self love and also kind of more like self preservation, also. And then that self-preservation kind of lens also lends itself into even more like kind of more modern takes. So like apparently it was like very big in like the Black Panther movement and like people of
Oh,
color
interesting.
things. Yeah, where it was like finding beauty within yourself despite the majority telling you that like only essentially like white
Mm.
like uniform kind of things are beautiful and acceptable. It was like learning to that's apparently when like, like afros were huge in like the kind of like 60s, 70s times. And it was
Mm-hmm.
because it was the first time where that community was really about like embracing their natural beauty and like embracing and accepting themselves for who they really are. So that was also like a big self-love movement. And also apparently like feminists were also like really like the feminist movement was really
Mm.
deep into this idea of self-love, but it was my interpretation is it was a lot more about like self-esteem and kind of like holding value within yourself, so that because their whole thing obviously was like gaining rights to be
Right.
equal to men, so it was like seeing the value within yourself and pushing to like gain that respect and the rights that they thought they deserved. So it's like super interesting because I was just like, oh, I thought this was all like, 2010s and on kind of
Hmm.
like concept, but it's actually, depending on how you interpret it, has like quite a history.
Yeah.
For me, I feel like we are like skewed, I think, because at least for me, the like first time I'm really thinking about these concepts of like self-love, self-care were more directly tied to, I would say, the last like ten years or
Same.
so, where it was like mental health related. So for me, the definition is really more about being kind to yourself,
Mm.
and similar to what you were saying, it's kind of like having the compassion to see and treat yourself the same way that you would see and treat like someone you care a lot about, like your friend or your partner or family member. Because to your point, it's like we're always the harshest critics of ourselves, right? It could
Yeah.
be like the exact same scenario, and you would be yelling at yourself and like criticizing yourself, but you would never act that way to your friend or
Hmm.
family member. You would say really loving and supportive things. And it's like, it is interesting that when it comes to self, a lot of times the default for a lot of us is to do more like self sabotage, where we're being
Yeah.
really mean to ourselves. So for me, it's really just about like, how do we apply that compassionate lens that we usually turn outwards more inwards instead?
I love that. And I totally agree with that. Are there certain things that you do kind of every day to remind yourself of that?
I think it's more about celebrating little wins and like, appreciating when I've put in more effort than I needed to or I thought I could. And so I think hearing that enough that like that's something I don't do, it is starting to finally like ignite a small voice in me where I have noticed like recently is like the little things. It's not even like a big thing. It's like, for example, I went running the other day and I hate running. Like I used to run. It used to be a thing I do, but like, once you fall out of sync of like a certain exercise routine, it's just
Yeah.
like so hard to get into. And I was like dying the last little leg. Like it was like I had like 1 mile left, and I was like, "Bitch, you got this, queen." I was just like, I heard this voice in my head. I was like, "You have come this far. Like you can do it." And it was just like, "Oh, I've never had this voice before." So I think
I
it's like,
love that.
yeah, it's like what you would say to a friend that's doing the same thing, but
Yeah.
finally just like saying it to yourself. It doesn't come often. I think it's still obviously like one of my biggest things I have to work on myself is like cultivating that voice, but I am starting to hear it a little bit more. It's not an everyday thing, and I don't have like an
Sure.
everyday routine per
Yeah.
se. How about you?
Well, recently my therapist put me on I'm homework that I'm not doing really great at. Well, his thing was basically like take some time to like breathe every day and like remind yourself of things that are like making you happy today. And more recently, kind of like what you were saying about the inner voice, I feel like it's more developing where I get into these negative thought loops sometimes and I get stuck there, and it's that whole like just being mean to yourself kind of thing where you're just like feeling down and then you like are further down on yourself, and the voice is stronger now. That's like, are you really like, is this negativity associated with the actual thing that you're not feeling happy about, or is it just like negativity that sits on top of your negativity that's like not connected, like it's you being down on yourself because you're down about something else? And that's become a little bit stronger, and that's like helped me break out of some unvirtuous cycles of thought. So that's definitely something that I am trying to like employ more, and I think there's a lot of connection to the meditation as well, because it's all about like noticing changes in your body and your like feeling and all that. And I feel like as I become more aware there, you're more aware of the thought loop, because usually what happens is you're not aware of it, and then suddenly you're stuck in it, and you're stuck in it like for an hour, and then you're like, oh wait, yeah, that was not what I like, where I was intending to go like with this thought pattern. So yeah, I think those are the two things, like just trying to remind myself on bad days like things I'm grateful for, and then just breaking the cycle of like negative thought loops before it gets like way down the line and like my day is ruined. So I think it's really interesting because, as you mentioned, there are like a lot of different concepts connected to self-love. And I think that there is this idea of like self-love or self-care going too far, and people like classifying anything that they do as a reaction to something negative as like, oh, this is self-care or this is self-love. And I do feel like there's this kind of thing where it's like people will say, I'm doing something as like self-care, but you're really just like dodging the problem, or you're like doing something that's not exactly like great for you. And that's I find that that's also kind of like funny because it's like kind of antithetical to like the whole idea of like giving yourself like accepting yourself instead of running away from your problems.
I can 100% vibe with that because the other stuff you'll see on the internet also, if you like Google this topic, is like the attachment with between self-care and like consumerism, right? And like we're all consumerists over here, Americans, y'all. So we buy a lot
Capitalists,
of
we're
shit, yeah,
capitalists.
for sure. But there, yeah, it's a booming industry. All this like self-care shit. It's literally like treat yourself, right? It's like to the extreme where you're just like, I'm just gonna like, oh, it's because I love myself so much. I'm gonna like do my nails every week. I'm gonna like buy this fancy like workout regimen thing to try. I'm gonna
Mm-hmm.
like do all these things that cost a bunch of money that's like supposed to make me feel better. I do think it's like everything in moderation, right? So like a little bit of that stuff, in my opinion, is like healthy and it's good because an occasional treat to yourself, right? Like when you become literally just like you're just buying shit all
Yeah.
the time for yourself, that's not a treat yourself. You're just like, I'm just wasting a lot of money.
Yeah.
And you are, I think you are just kind of like diverting. You're like trying to run away from something at
Yeah.
that point when you're just
Yeah.
like shoving money down like multiple industries. So yeah, I think that's a danger zone, and also, like, for me personally, I don't necessarily veer too hard into, like, buying a bunch of shit for myself, but for example, like, we've talked about this, one challenge I had with doing this podcast full time now is, like, when we're in the kind of, like, quote, unquote, "off season," when we don't have live episodes, it is the time that we purposely build in so that we can rest and, like,
Mm-hmm.
recharge, but because I then have so much less workload from like not live editing and posting all this content. I have almost too much time on my hands. And so I tend to like veer too far into the like laziness track where then I'm
Mm.
like, I watched so much Netflix a day. It's like absurd. So I do think you need to kind of like find a balance of like things and activities that are like legitimate forms of self-love that are good in moderation, but like don't take it to the extreme because then you're just kind of like pushing, that's not really the spirit of self-love anymore.
Yeah.
You're just like indulging really
Yeah.
heavily into something.
But I honestly, at the end of the day, like you should treat yourself to the treat things that you want and not feel bad about it. But it shouldn't become like you shouldn't be self-soothing with that purchase. Basically, I
Yeah,
think that's
exactly.
the difference. So I think we also maybe wanted to talk about a little bit like if you feel like there's a difference in your journey towards loving yourself versus my journey because you're straight, straight. We've never talked about it
Oh,
officially.
like, are you
For the
asking me or
record,
are you
Angela
like
is,
ashamed of me? Oh, yeah, I'm straight.
yeah, and I'm gay.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you found that to be, I mean, it's also really hard to say like what's different because everyone's journey is so different to begin with. But um, I, I think it's just like a little bit harder for people that are not straight to come to an acceptance of themselves. And I think the main reason why is they're just, you don't really see that many people that you can model your perspective of like happiness and also your perspective of building this idea of yourself and how to like reconcile these pieces of yourself and how to give yourself that like grace and love. And I think that's the main, that's like the most difficult thing for people who are like in the LGBTQIA plus community, because it's really hard. And like, when you're going through an experience that you don't understand, a lot of the times you just go to somebody who's gone through that experience before and you're like, hey, like, how did you deal with this? And like, what were the steps you went through to try to make yourself feel better, kind of like what we do with our friends. But it's always much more difficult when you don't have a person that has gone through that same exact experience. So you never get exactly, I think, the advice that you're looking for. You might get like 80% of it where you're like, this all feels right. But then you feel like you're missing like a piece of it because the person that you're talking to just doesn't have the same kind of experience. And I think from the gay, I'll just say gay perspective, that is probably like the most difficult thing, because I can tell you for sure, aside from, you know, the caricatures you see in mass media, there really wasn't anybody of the community that I could be like, and what is your retirement plan? And like, how do you have like plan to have children? And like, you know, what were the life difficult, like the largest challenges in life that you went through? Like, I didn't really have anyone like that that I could speak to for a while until I was probably like in college. Um, so I do feel like that is like probably the biggest barrier to finding yourself and self love.
Yeah, I think your journey is definitely completely different from my journey. I mean, I think the main difference being that like the LGBTQ, like, which community is the queer community, right? Is like, I mean, it's not the standard default, quote unquote standard default, right? So like whenever you're not whatever is the quote unquote majority in some whatever lens you're putting on it, right? It is most common to feel like something's wrong with you, like, or that something's lacking in you, right? And that's because other people, that's what you're hearing from essentially like external factors by like reaffirming that like there's this one way that is like the most normal and you don't fit that. So then it's like, how do you learn to love yourself outside of the things that society is constantly reaffirming as like the normal and lovable things?
Mm-hmm.
So that totally makes sense to me why it would be difficult to find self-love when you can't even find yourself necessarily reflected or represented by like the majority of society.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you have a totally different experience from me. For me, like, I mean, around this like topic of self-love, right, and self-care, blah blah blah, I would say the only thing that would make me more exactly the target audience for all this messaging would be if I was a white woman instead of an Asian woman, right? But like it's all like straight white females as like the main target audience towards this concept of self-love, self-care, like Gwyneth Paltrow, for example, right? Like she's kind of like the emblem of this kind of like phenomenon. So I whatever I struggle with is just like within myself because everyone has individual struggles, but I think from like an identity standpoint, totally different from you
Yeah.
because I don't have like besides obviously growing up wishing I was white, like I didn't have
Mm-hmm.
other things telling me like you are completely unlovable and you're not the normal, I didn't have that. So
Well, on that note, listeners, we would love to hear from you on your experience in self love. Do you have difficulties loving yourself? What are some practices that you found that really have helped transform how you see yourself and how you relate to yourself? We would love to hear from you on the socials.
and come back next week for another fresh new episode. And until then, 再见,
Zaijian,
bitches.
bitches.